I was fast asleep, deep in dreamland, when my dog Barney woke me up. At first, I ignored him. My eyes stung, and my alarm clock showed me that it was only 3 a.m. It was far too early for anyone to be awake, and yet he was insistent. He wasn't just barking. He was also running back and forth from the door, as if he wanted me to follow him. I eventually gave in, if only to get him to shut up so I could hurry back to bed. I almost tripped over one of his toys on the way out the door, and I just managed to steady myself when I heard something. It was faint at first, but the further down the hall I went, the louder it became. It sounded like someone was being strangled. Fear shot through my body. The only people in the house at the time were me and my little sister, Cassie. Our parents were away at a conference, and they'd warned me about locking all the doors and windows. I panicked. Had I forgotten to lock the door? Had someone snuck in? An image shot through my head, one in which my sister was being attacked by an intruder. My head told me to run back to my room and lock the door, but my heart forced me down the hall, and before I realized what I was doing, I found myself banging on the bathroom door. The door was locked, and when I banged on it, my sister went silent. All I could hear was Barney barking by my side and the wind rustling in the trees outside. It was so spooky, and I had a bad feeling, like when you know something horrible is about to happen. "Let me in, Cassie. What's going on? Are you okay? If someone is hurting you, I'll call the police. I'll do it. I'll call them right now." My heart was thumping in my chest, and I waited for someone to reply. "Oh, please, don't let there be someone in there with her," I prayed. "Lola, go away. I'm fine. I just feel a bit sick. Please go back to bed," my sister replied. Then I heard her cry, like the crying that vibrates throughout your whole body before turning into a scream. No, I couldn't just leave her in there like that. Even if there was someone in there hurting her, I had to save her. She was my little sister. I took a few steps back and then ran towards the door, bashing it with my hip. It didn't budge. The doors in our house were old, but I knew that if I pushed it enough, it would open. I threw myself against it with all my weight, and suddenly the door burst open. I fell onto the ground, catching my fall with my hands. Well, there was no one in there with my sister. It was just her. I gasped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was squatting on the floor, her face bright red, and then I looked up at her more closely, and that's when I saw it. A bump. My sister was pregnant. In fact, not only was she pregnant, she was giving birth right in front of me. "Cassie, what's going on?" I stammered. She didn't reply. She just looked at me and let out a blood-curdling scream. The baby was clearly on the way. What was I supposed to do? I realized I was still sitting on the ground where I'd fallen, so I scrambled across to her and reached out for her hand. She was gripping onto the bath, and her contractions were coming in fast. I was absolutely clueless. I'd only ever seen this happen in movies. How had this happened to her? Let me just add that I didn't even know Cassie had a boyfriend. We weren't exactly the kind of sisters that told each other everything. In fact, we were pretty distant. It hadn't always been this way, though. When we were little girls, we were inseparable. Cassie was the little baby sister I'd always dreamed about. And because our parents worked so much, we looked out for each other. Without even realizing, I'd adopted a kind of motherly role towards her, always doing her hair and helping her with her homework. Our mom and dad were both big-shot lawyers who devoted almost all their time to work. When we were really young, we didn't mind so much. We had each other, and that was all that mattered to us. But when I was about 10 years old, I decided my little sister was annoying. I didn't want her to go everywhere with me anymore. I had my own friends, and it wasn't cool to be seen with an 8-year-old hanging onto my arm at all times. So one day, she tried to get into my room when my best friend was over, and I shouted at her. I told her to leave me alone and find her own friends. Well, that ended up being one of the worst days of our life. Cassie ran away, and I felt completely irresponsible. We ended up finding her in a field later that evening, hiding behind a haystack. She was crying and shivering, saying she didn't want to come home unless our mom stopped working so much. I hadn't really thought about it up until then, just how much our parents worked. We had a babysitter, and that seemed the norm to us. That whole day, I'd thought she'd run away because of my comment, but really, that was just the breaking point. She'd run away for attention, and that was just the start of it. She pretty much went off the rails after that. She was caught smoking behind the science department at school when she was only 12. And then, when she was 14, she got suspended from school for cheating on an exam. She'd always been such a sweet kid, but even I could see that the amount our parents worked was affecting her. I mean, I felt it too, but for some reason, I just accepted it. And now, here we were, Cassie about to push out a baby. I knew it wasn't the right time to ask her how on earth she'd got herself into this situation, and why she'd kept it from us. Actually, how had I not noticed? Suddenly, I felt guilty. Had I been so caught up in my own world that I failed to notice she was pregnant? Honestly, who can hide a baby bump for 9 months? Seeing her here now, squatting on the floor like that, I realized she was massive, like a whale. I didn't want to leave her, but I had to get my phone. We needed to call an ambulance. When I got up to leave, she started crying and asked me to stay. She said she was scared and didn't want to be alone any longer. I told her the ambulance would be here in no time, and that's when she started bawling her eyes out, begging me not to call one. Was she joking? We needed a doctor here, ASAP. I got up to leave. I needed to make that call, but it was too late. She let out a scream that sent shivers up my spine, and that's when I realized the baby was on its way. In fact, it was already coming out. And that's how I ended up delivering my little sister's baby on our bathroom floor. I won't go into the gory details, but let's just say I don't ever want to do that again. Keep in mind, the whole time this was going on, Barney was bouncing around, barking like a maniac. I went to call an ambulance, and while I was on my way to get my phone, I heard a knock at the door. It was the middle of the night. Who could it be? It's not like this night could get any worse. So I ran down to open it. Standing there were 2 policemen, and they could clearly see something was up. I had blood on my hands and sweat all over my face. And I wasn't even the one who'd given birth. It definitely looked like a murder scene. They asked if everything was okay, and then I explained. They were relieved and immediately called an ambulance for us. Turns out our neighbors had heard screams and called the police. No wonder they were relieved, although I wasn't. At that moment in time, I didn't know what was better, an intruder or this surprise baby. We got to the hospital, and Cassie and the baby got cleaned up. Only when we were safely in the hospital room did I realize the extent of what had just happened. My sister was a mom. I now had a baby nephew. It was just all so surreal. One thing was for sure, our parents would go mental when they find out. Cassie dozed off, but I just sat there, my head aching with it all. In the morning, Cassie finally had enough energy to tell me what was going on. She could barely look at me as she told me. A year ago, she'd started dating a guy from another school. He was a bit of a rebel, and she'd said she'd only been drawn to him because she wanted to upset our parents. She did it for attention, and getting pregnant had been a complete accident. She wouldn't tell me who the guy was, even when I demanded to know his name. She just said it was all a big mistake and that the guy was bad news, and that he didn't even know she'd been pregnant. It hadn't even crossed my mind. I mean, looking back, I could see that over the past year she'd been particularly distant with me, but then I assumed it was just because we both had a lot going on with school and friends and stuff, like typical teenage stuff. Never in a million years would I have ever guessed she could have been pregnant. I asked her what she wanted to do. Our parents would obviously find out, especially because she was only 16. I doubted the hospital would even discharge her without our parents' permission. Oh, she was going to be in deep trouble. What happened next really surprised me. Cassie said she had secretly been planning to give the baby up for adoption so that no one would ever find out. I was shocked. I mean, it was probably the most realistic thing to do in this situation, but looking at my nephew all curled up in his little blanket, if it was my baby, I don't think I could bear it. But she was serious. She said that she had the official papers ready and that there were already a few families interested, and it was as good as a done deal. I didn't understand how she could do this. After breakfast, a nurse came in and told my sister that she had 1 hour left with her son, and then he would be taken to the nursery room to wait for his new adoptive parents. What? How could all this happen so fast? My sister looked numb. After the nurse left the room, the magnitude of what she was about to do hit her, and it hit her like a ton of bricks. She was inconsolable. I held her as she cried and cried. She didn't say it, but I could tell. She regretted what was about to happen. It's true what they say. When you hold your newborn baby, there's no going back. It's like an instant kind of love. I felt so sorry for my sister. I wish I could have done something to help her. After they took the baby away, my sister looked like she'd just lost a part of herself. She cried all day and all of the next night, gripping onto the blanket we'd put him in on the way to the hospital. The only thing she said that whole day was, "I regret it, Lola. I want him back. He's my baby. Please help me. I don't think I can live without him." I couldn't stand seeing her like this. I had to get her baby back. My sister was pregnant. In fact, not only was she pregnant, she was giving birth right in front of me. Cassie said she had secretly been planning to give the baby up for adoption. I regret it, Lola. I want him back. He's my baby. Please. Our parents still had 2 more days to go of the conference they were attending. So I at least felt safe in the knowledge that by then, Cassie would be home and they wouldn't know. I could go home and clean up the bathroom and hide all the evidence of the birth that had taken place there. They'd never know. Except now, Casey wanted her baby back, and I was willing to do anything to help her achieve this. As I said, we weren't very close anymore, but something about helping your own sister give birth, well, it just brings you together, whether you like it or not. We'd shared something raw and real, and I would do anything to make her happy now. The most simple thing would have been to get our parents on the case. After all, they are lawyers, and they deal with this legal kind of stuff all the time. But that just wasn't an option. Cassie wasn't allowed to leave the hospital for 48 hours after giving birth. So we still had another 24 hours to go. I went home and cleaned up and thought about what we were going to do. I Googled it, and I realized that without our parents' signatures, the adoption wasn't even legal. I rushed back to the hospital to tell her the good news, but I realized as soon as I did, something was wrong. She didn't look happy at all. She looked down at her hands, and tears formed in her eyes as she looked back up at me. "Lola, I forged their signatures," she said in a very small voice. Oh my gosh! Of all of the people she could have chosen to forge the signature of, and she chose our parents who are lawyers, they could lose their jobs. I was suddenly angry at Cassie. Up until then, I'd been fairly calm. I accepted the fact that she'd gotten pregnant, that she decided to give the baby up for adoption, but this was taking it too far. This was a proper disaster, and I couldn't think of another loophole we could jump through. I so badly wanted to scream at her and ask her why she'd been so stupid. But when I looked at her and saw how sad she looked, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. She'd just said goodbye to her baby, and I feared she wouldn't be able to handle any more stress and pain for one day. Instead, I sat there feeling helpless. On the one hand, she wanted to keep this a secret from our parents. On the other hand, all she wanted was her baby back. I didn't see how we could do this, but I felt like I had to do this for her, if only to show that she wasn't alone in all of this. We're family, and that's what family does for each other. I did some more research while Cassie napped. I was exhausted by this point, but I was determined to figure this out. As far as everyone was concerned, our parents really had signed the adoption papers. But then I found something interesting. There was one exception to the rule. If the birth father was never involved in the adoption, and the adoption took place without his consent, then he could get involved and get the baby back for Cassie. This was it. This was how we'd get the baby back. However, there was one small problem. I had no idea who the father was, and Cassie hadn't seemed keen to tell me. But surely she'd agree to tell me now that we knew this could solve her problem, right? No, she wasn't keen at all. I woke her up from her nap and told her I'd just made another discovery. Again, she looked sad as I excitedly told her. What was her problem? I was just trying to help. I felt close to tears too, but tears of frustration. If she wasn't going to disclose any information about him, then I'd just go out there and find him myself. I mean, how hard could it be? I first did what anyone else would do. I went back home and searched my sister's room from top to bottom. She'd left her phone on her bedside table, but of course it was locked. I tried every pin under the sun, but still couldn't get in. There was no evidence whatsoever that would tell me who he was. So then I went onto her Facebook profile and started checking her new friends. Then something caught my eye. There was a photo of her with two guys. I didn't recognize them at all, but their names were there. I opened up both their profiles and was shocked to find that one of them no longer existed. He deleted his profile. Surely it was him. The other guy looked too sweet. My sister had specifically said he was the rebellious type. I was shaking as I put his name Skylar into Google, and then I felt sick. No wonder my sister hadn't told him she was pregnant. This guy was in a juvenile delinquency center. I read on. Last year, he'd committed a series of petty crimes and ended up being taken to court and landing himself in jail. Pretty much. I couldn't believe it. This was the father of my sister's baby? Suddenly, my plan didn't seem like a good idea. Legally, could I even get this guy involved? He seemed dangerous, and it scared me. I had to do something, though. Our parents would be back the following day, and then who knew what would happen? Well, I got straight on it. I called the center, and they told me that I couldn't visit unless I was family, and that if it was urgent, I'd need to seek legal help. I was desperate, so I called the only other lawyer I knew other than our parents, my best friend's dad. I realized I felt attached to the baby too, in some weird kind of way. He was my nephew after all, and the thought of him being with a family of strangers, it wasn't worth thinking about. I explained everything to my friend's dad and waited with bated breath for him to respond. He was completely silent on the other end of the line. All I could hear was him taking a deep breath in and then exhaling on a sigh. Oh no, I thought he didn't want to get involved. But then he replied and asked me to meet him at the center in 30 minutes. He said he would call the adoption agency and get the papers and just check everything over. I was so excited as I drove over there and thought about calling the hospital to get them to tell my sister. But then I thought I'd just surprise her. My friend's dad was already there when I arrived, pacing back and forth in front of the entrance. He was a busy man, and I felt guilty getting him involved, but I knew he could help. We went in and had to go through some vigorous security checks before being allowed into the visitor's room. I recognized Skylar straight away from his photo, and from the way he raised his eyebrows at me, I thought maybe he recognized me too. I mean, Cassie and I did look quite alike. He sat down and folded his arms in front of his chest. It was clear he didn't want to speak to us. I explained who I was and why I was there, and then my best friend's dad explained the legal stuff. He had a copy of the adoption papers, and as he put them down on the table, I could see our parents' forged signatures. I cringed. This was not good. Skylar actually laughed after we'd both finished speaking. And it was strange because he didn't even seem surprised that Cassie had been pregnant. I didn't understand. Cassie had told me he didn't know anything about it. He looked at us and said, "So, what do you actually want?" Because Cassie and I had already agreed to put the baby up for adoption. In fact, it was my cousin and his wife who adopted the baby. So don't come here and try and say she wants it back. It's a done deal already. And anyway, my cousin and his wife tried for 5 years to have a baby, but couldn't. We're actually helping them. I was lost for words. Cassie had lied to me. What was I doing running around trying to help her? She was nothing but a secretive little liar, and I'd gone so far as to find a lawyer lawyer. I was on the verge of tears when my best friend's dad spoke up. "Skylar, I understand. I apologize for bothering you like this, but we were under the impression that you didn't know you were even a father." I was so embarrassed. This was all Cassie's fault. I was wasting everyone's time. Then something inside me clicked. The signatures weren't real. Our parents hadn't actually signed the papers, which meant this wasn't even legal. But then, did I even care if she got the baby back now? Before I'd even thought it through, I blurted out the truth. Skylar laughed and said they'd had no other option and that Cassie hadn't been allowed to visit the center. But then he remembered we were in the presence of a lawyer and he shut up quickly. "Hang on, you mean to tell me these signatures were forged? Well, that changes everything. This contract is not even legally binding then. In fact, your sister Cassie could be in a lot of trouble." I felt sick. This was a disaster. First, the father of her baby was in jail, and now the mother could be heading in that direction too. If I just kept quiet, none of this would be happening. We were in a real predicament. And then my phone started to ring. It was my dad. I froze. I couldn't possibly answer. And then something dawned on me. I hadn't told my best friend's dad that our parents hadn't actually signed the papers. I'd left that part out by accident, and now I had a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. So I answered. And I'd been right. I could actually feel the steam coming out of his ears. He said him and Mom were driving to the hospital right now. I didn't even have time to reply before he hung up. I had to get there before they did and warn Cassie. Again, Skylar just laughed. He seemed to find it all very entertaining, and that just annoyed me even more. I was too late. Our parents must have driven at like 1,000 miles per hour. Cassie was in tears, Mom was hysterical, and Dad was fuming. As I walked into the room, Cassie looked at me and said, "How could you?" I wanted the ground to swallow me up. I was officially the worst sister on the planet. I wish I could say that it was all one big happy ending, that we got the baby back and that Skylar got released from the center and that our parents forgave Cassie, but I'd be lying if I said it panned out like that. Basically, our parents went berserk. Somehow they managed to get through some legal loophole, and they signed the adoption papers for real this time. My sister wasn't in any legal trouble, as there was a 1-month leeway with this kind of thing anyway. Our parents were hurt that Cassie had fallen pregnant in the first place, but more hurt when they realized she'd hidden it from all of us and gone behind our backs. Cassie realized she was too young to raise a baby on her own, and so that is why Skylar's cousin and wife still have the baby. Everyone agreed it was for the best. And even though I know my sister still regrets it all, I think she can see how happy she has made that one family. She gave them a chance to have everything they always wanted. And there's no denying that actually, that is a pretty beautiful ending, right? Oh, and as for me, Cassie and our parents, well, we're actually a lot closer now. I think this whole thing really shook up my parents, especially my mom. So she's cut back on her hours, and we actually spend a lot more time together now. Crazy how sometimes something big has to happen for us to stop and realize what we all have right in front of us. What do you think of my family story? Please share your comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories.